Hello everybody, Mr. McKeever here. Today we're going to talk about World War One, and particularly the fighting of World War One. I mean, we've already talked about the beginning of the war, we've already talked about the various alliances, militarism, nationalism, imperialism, how they all helped cause World War One. But let's talk about the actual fighting itself. So when the war itself begins, most of Europe is kind of anticipating a very fast war. Everyone had a lot of confidence in their own military prowess. Military advancements had taken leaps and bounds between the last great European conflict, which was the Crimean War. So everyone kind of thought that they were going to win, and it was going to be fast, and it was going to be decisive. Particularly if you're the Germans, who had this incredible war history now. Bismarck had won a series of wars against many of the major powers of Europe, whether it was Austria, whether it was France, whoever it was, Bismarck came out on top. But that is not going to be what actually happens here, for a variety of reasons. One, the technology that exists now requires a different level of thinking, different type of thinking than what people were prepared for at the beginning of the war. The war plans that both the French and the Germans and the other major powers of Europe had established prior to the start of World War I were still using tactics and mentalities that were indicative of 19th century warfare and not this new 20th century warfare, a warfare that's built around the use of machine guns and poison gas and these other technological tools that have really changed warfare. So let's talk about these plans and talk about how they're a little bit inadequate. First up, if you're the Germans, your battle plan was to avoid the French. And we introduced something called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a clever attempt to deal with the fact that the French had spent the last 30 or so years fortifying their border between France and Germany. They had created something that we call the Maginot Line. It was a giant set of walls that were built with turrets and entrenchments to allow them to repel an attack from the German army. Well, the Germans, being the clever and ingenuitive people that they are, decided that it would be dumb to attack the wall and decided that their plan was going to be to avoid it entirely and to invade France through Belgium. Use their fast-moving forces, go through Belgium as fast as possible, and go directly at the city of Paris. This would be the ideal. So as you can see from the image on the screen right now, that dotted line was the ideal route. And you're going to go through Brussels all the way around and you would attack Paris from the west. The idea was that the French forces would not be prepared for this, and if you could easily knock out Paris, then the war itself would be over within months. Well, that isn't what happened. The Germans weren't able to get all the way around Paris. The French were able to respond faster, and what we see is the battles actually break out around the Marne River. And that's where we get our first major conflict. The plan doesn't work, and instead what we get is what is indicative of World War I, what we call a stalemate. Skipping the video right there. The Battle of the Marne, which is the first major conflict of the Western Front in World War I, is going to introduce a new type of warfare in World War I. Within 3 days of the fighting beginning at the Battle of the Marne, 400,000 people are dead. Europe had never seen death tolls like this before. People were dying at a faster rate than they had ever seen. And the reality was that you couldn't just run into the other side and hope to beat them quickly. You would just lose too many forces too fast. So instead, both the French and the Germans decide that this war can't be won by a quick blitz into the other side. So they decide to dig trenches and fight out a much longer conflict. And this is going to introduce the tactic of trench warfare. Literally digging trenches on the battlefield, going into those trenches, and having a series of attack and counterattack across an area in hopes of gaining territory and pushing the enemy farther back. And this is not going to be the fast warfare that pretty much everyone agreed or at least believed was going to take place at the start of World War I. Trench warfare on the Western Front is going to take 4 years and cost millions of people their lives. It is exclusively on the Western Front, as we just said, and most of the time you saw very little, if none, actual territory gains. At best, you could maybe make an advancement of a mile or so, but oftentimes then you would end up going right back when the other side counterattacks. The living conditions were terrible. They were cold, and you couldn't really stand up because you took the threat of sniper rifle fire. Then you had mortar fire at any time. It was just a truly traumatic experience for the soldiers who lived through it. That is, if you survived, because death tolls were insurmountably high. Countries were literally just throwing bodies at bullets and hoping that they would survive. So, in Russia, on the Eastern Front, you saw a different story. Whereas in the West, you saw a stalemate between the French and the Germans. In the East, you saw a Russian army that was vastly unprepared for this conflict. Germany was technologically as advanced as any nation in Europe, if not more. Their military was the best in Europe. The Russians were still fighting with 1700s technology. Germans are using jeeps. They will eventually introduce tanks. Russians are fighting with horses, single bullet muskets. Germans are using machine guns. And the end result is that within 1 year, Germany had lost 1 million people. Within the first couple years of the war, Russia lost over 4 million people. They are going to be an incredible amount of the death toll of World War I. The Germans just obliterated them. It was real unfortunate for the Russian people. The Austrians themselves aren't going to be a major player in the actual fighting, even though they actually share a much closer border with the Russians. And the ideal originally with the Central Powers was that Austria was going to kind of primarily focus on Russia, Germany on France. The reality is that Austria really couldn't knock out Russia as quickly as intended, so Germany would come to their aid, and they're the ones who really inflict the greater amount of death toll on the Russian people. So, it's a disaster. Horses versus machine guns. I'm sure you can figure out what the outcome is going to be here. And realizing upon the fact that they were just vastly underprepared for this war, they kind of decide that, hey, we're going to own it. And our tactic is going to be real simple. We're going to play a war of attrition. The Germans will run out of bullets before we run out of Russians. That was the mentality. Keep throwing soldiers at them, and eventually the Germans will break. And in an old type of warfare, that would work. That was the way the Russians effectively fought the Napoleonic Wars. They had that many people. But in a new modern warfare scenario where you can fire 100 bullets a minute, that's not going to work. The Germans are just going to massacre the Russians. And World War I reaches a new level. Russia is forced to ask for help. And what we see is an attempt by the British to do that. So it becomes very apparent to the Allies in the war that if Russia is unable to kind of stabilize the situation, they're going to be knocked out very quickly. And Germany could then focus all of their efforts on the West. And early on, the fear was that Britain and France could not hold off a German war machine if all of their effort was focused in France. So what we're going to see is some plans developed in order to really alleviate the situation in the East, try to help the Russians out. And what we call this plan is the Gallipoli Campaign. Originally devised and orchestrated by an Undersecretary of the Navy named Winston Churchill, the idea was that the British would create an open trade line through the Mediterranean and then potentially through the Black Sea by taking the city of Istanbul from the Ottoman Empire. At this point, the Ottoman Empire was really out of the conflict still. They were not a major player in things, and if you remember from prior units, they're trying to go through a bit of a reimagining of their own empire. Well, the British attempt to do this blows up. As you can see from the map right here, control of the Black Sea is really controlled exclusively by the city of Istanbul. An area that we call the Dardanelles is a constriction point. that ships have to pass through in order to connect the Mediterranean and Black Seas. And the Ottoman Empire had zero intention of allowing British ships just to travel through these areas. So a British attempt to go through the Dardanelles is going to draw the Ottoman Empire in the war, and the British were pretty aware of this, and they really just didn't care. The Ottoman Empire was never considered a viable threat to the British, or even the French, or even the Russians, really. They were the quote-unquote sick man of Europe. So the British will attempt to push through. But realizing that the British are trying to do this, the Ottomans fortify. And with the help of the Germans, create a veritable death trap for the British forces. As you can see from the image, they line the walls of the Dardanelles with emplacement guns. They put mines in the water itself, and British ships will try to come in and take the area in order to create this established trade route, and it leads to the death of pretty much everyone. Gallipoli is an incredible disaster, and it has a variety of outcomes. First, Gallipoli will make this a global war. The British use mostly their colonial troops to do this. People from India, South Africa, Asia. It is also going to really alienate Russia. Russia's never going to get the help that they needed in order to fight off the Germans, which is going to quickly expedite their situation and an eventual exit from World War I. And lastly, it's going to lead to the firing of the undersecretary who planned this, the guy Winston Churchill, and he's going to decide to reevaluate his life and decide to go into politics instead. Outside of Europe, once this becomes a global campaign with Gallipoli, it doesn't stop that. Eventually, the Japanese will enter World War I as well as the Chinese on the side of the Allies, and they will look to purge East Asia from European influence, particularly German influence. The Japanese will be the more effective of the two in doing this. If you remember again from earlier this unit, Japan had rapidly industrialized at the end of the 19th century with the Meiji Restoration. They had shown that they could be a legitimate military power with their defeating the Russian army at the Russo-Japanese War. And Germany is kind of pushed out of East Asia. Why we bring this up is because there's some lingering outcomes here. One, the Japanese enthusiasm in liberating German territory probably should have been a warning sign that Japan was doing this largely for expansionist purposes. They were trying to build an empire. And also, when it comes down to the post-war negotiations and everything, because the Allies completely ignore China's contributions to this, they're going to help expedite the rise of a new government in China, really destabilizing what is left of imperial China in the process. So, yeah, a little bit of a mess up here later on. Alright, so back in Europe, what's going on? Well, the fighting gets progressively worse and worse in Russia, and the Western Front is also dealing with its heaviest fighting. The worst portions of the Western fight really take place at the Battle of the Somme. It was a joint British and French effort to break the German lines, and the battle itself leads to 1 million dead soldiers for no significant gains in territory. And warfare is just at an all-time disaster during this period. And eventually it's going to break not only from the land but also to the sea. And it comes in the form of German U-boats. The British had the best navy in the world. There was really no question to that. Everyone knew that going into World War I. And even the Germans did, and they kind of conceded that reality. While the Germans had some tremendous battleships, which you don't really know about, things like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, who are these magnificent engineering feats and incredible warships, they just didn't have the volume that the British did. So the Germans are going to turn their efforts from creating battleships to creating U-boats. And U-boats are exactly as they sound. They're submarines, as you can see from the image here. They're the earliest form of underwater boat. And this was supposed to help even the battlefields. U-boats could not be seen from the surface. You could attack a British warship without them being able to really attack back. And because of this, warfare on the sea changes dramatically. while the German Navy never gets out of the North Sea because the British kind of blockade them in. German U-boats are able to travel all around the Atlantic, around France, up to the United States, wherever, because you couldn't detect what was going on. They could travel huge chunks of territory without ever having to surface. So, this is great for the Germans, it's bad for everyone else. And once the Germans realize that things are starting to turn poorly for them, they're going to kind of open up this as being a primary war effort for them. So in an attempt to try and quicken the war effort, Britain attempts to blockade all food and supplies going to Germany. Technically, you're not supposed to do that. You can't block food and medical supplies, even during a time of war. There are ethics issues here. Well, the Germans respond with if you're going to try to blockade and starve our people, then we're going to open fire on any and every ship, period. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship found anywhere near Britain, the Germans are liable to sink. Well, crap. Warfare takes a new level during this period, and unrestricted submarine warfare is going to have a few unintended consequences, and they come with this. The United States is going to be dragged into World War I. In some ways, kicking and screaming. In some ways, just a little bit longer of a wait than some people intended. The United States is going to be brought into World War I when the Germans sink a British passenger liner called the HMS Lusitania. The HMS Lusitania is a ship with about 120 or so American citizens on it, and quite a few more British ones, over 1,000. And when it sinks, pretty much everyone on board dies. The Germans fired on the Lusitania for what at this point in time is a very clear reason. It seemed very apparent to the Germans that the ship was carrying weapons aboard. And they're probably right, because they fired a single torpedo at the Lusitania, and the Lusitania was underwater in under 20 minutes. And unless there was secondary explosions on the ship caused by munitions exploding, that really should not have taken place. So warfare changes. World War I opened it up to civilians were kind of a viable target now, and with the sinking of the Lusitania, the United States will come into the war, and unfortunately for the Germans, the war ends pretty quickly after that. While Russia will be forced out of World War I, which is a conversation we'll talk about later, the United States coming into the war meant that Germany had no prayer. Our ability to just insert hundreds of thousands, if not millions of soldiers, fresh soldiers who were fully equipped with the best technology in the world, was something the Germans could not really deal with. So World War I will start boiling to an end. When it does, Germany's going to struggle a bit. The post-war effort and the post-war negotiations are not going to be kind to the German people. But that's a story for a different day. Welcome to eventually the rise of communism in the world. Thanks.